Thank you, Owen. And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 7th online talk in our series of inspirational women's stories from the home of the mother of Methodism herself, Susanna Wesley. So today you'll see I'm back in my office, the quietest place in the rectory, as currently we have workmen on site. So my apologies in advance if somebody with a blue hard hat pops up at the window behind me. Today we welcome Jill Barber, latterly one of my Methodist Heritage colleagues, who was the manager at Anglesey Book Museum near Stoke-on-Trent. And many of you will remember Jill as a past vice president of the conference a couple of years back. Now I checked that and it was actually 2015, 2016, so time really flies. Jill's research interest lies very much in primitive Methodism, and she has an
Jill, we just need you to unmute.
Have I been muted the whole way?
Yeah, so no, I think that was a mistake on my part. My thumb slipped, so apologies. Sorry, Jill.
Okay. I don't know how much everybody heard, but it was
only just a second. Don't worry. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just go back to say that Jill's research interests lie very much in the history of primitive Methodism, and she has a particular interest in its females' history. She is widely regarded as a real advocate in sharing their stories, as we will hear today. Today, we are going to hear about those women who were compelled to preach, telling the world what they felt from the pulpit, just as Susanna was compelled to obey God rather than men. We've all had the joining instructions from Owen, so questions in chat to Owen. Hopefully we're all muted. I'm going to now mute myself as I'm now ready to hand over to Jill to get started. Over to you, Jill.
Thank you. Right, I'll just share my screen a moment. And right, hopefully you can all see that.
Yeah, that's great.
Good, thanks, Owen. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to Susanna's kitchen this afternoon. Now, I'm always really surprised when people say to me, oh, you can't mix religion and politics. And that always reminds me of Susanna Wesley, because of course that's just what she did. So today I want to start with looking at Susanna, and then I want to look at 6 Methodist women, all of whom felt compelled to speak out because they believed that loving your neighbour is a profoundly political statement. Okay, let's start with Susanna. This is where I work out how that's it, right. There we go. I'm never quite sure if that's the right picture of Susanna. It may be now the picture that we think isn't Susanna, but there we go. There she is with Samuel. And of course, in 1702, the biggest political issue in Britain was who's the rightful king. Now, Samuel Wesley supported King William III, but Susanna was a Jacobite. And of course, you'll know that that means she supported the son, Charles Stuart, of James II, who was thrown out in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. So anyway, one day after family prayers, Samuel asked Susanna why she didn't say Amen after his prayers for the king. And she replied, because I do not believe the Prince of Orange to be king. And Samuel flew into a rage and said, if that be the case, you and I must part, for if we have 2 kings, we must have 2 beds. And he vowed he wouldn't ever touch her or come to her bed again unless she begged God's pardon and his for not saying Amen to the prayer for the king. Well, as you can imagine, they both refused to back down. and Samuel left the house for London, refusing to come back until Susanna apologised. And Susanna felt torn between her loyalty to her conscience and her loyalty to her husband. But she decided it would be mocking Almighty God if she begged pardon for what she thought was not a sin. And in the months that followed, William III died, but Samuel was still demanding that Susanna ask for forgiveness. And actually, this whole issue was only resolved when the villagers set fire to the rectory at Epworth. It wasn't the Great Fire, it was an earlier fire, and 2/3 of the house was destroyed. And Susanna declared it was God's vengeance on Samuel. But he was so shaken at what could have happened to his family that he backed down and he came back to Epworth. And it's quite interesting that for Susanna Wesley, this was a matter of religious conscience as well as a political act. And following in her footsteps were other women who were prepared to take a stand and say that they felt impelled to obey God and not man. So one of those, let's have a look there. The first one I want to look at was Dorothy Ripley. Now, Dorothy was born in 1767 in Whitby, where her father was one of Wesley's preachers. He was a stonemason. He actually was responsible for building the first Methodist chapel in Whitby. And John Wesley often stayed with the Ripleys. So Dorothy would probably have heard and been at the table maybe when John was talking. And it may have been through those conversations that she heard about the iniquity of the slave trade and slavery in America, because of course, John Wesley was one of the very first active anti-slavery campaigners, and he had first experience as well from his time in Georgia. But as well as these conversations, Dorothy was very influenced by something that had happened when she was a child. She was with her mother in the docks at Whitby, and they came across a woman who was clearly, she was a prostitute, but she'd been surrounded by a group of sailors who had tarred and feathered her and stripped her and were tormenting her. And Dorothy's mother, who must have been a formidable character, we don't know much about her, she saw off the sailors and she made Dorothy, who was hiding in an alley, come out and help the woman to get dressed. And that early encounter sparked in Dorothy a lifetime passion for helping the oppressed, and particularly women. Well, increasingly, Dorothy felt God was calling her to preach, but also particularly to go to America to preach freedom from slavery for the enslaved people. But back in England, you see, attitudes to women were hardening. The church wouldn't accept Dorothy's call. It was quite a while later, it was eventually in her early 30s, that she felt she just couldn't put off God's call any longer. She had to respond and she had to obey God and not man. And so she set off from Whitby, determined to get to America. I found this quite incredible that she set off, a single woman, she didn't have any money. She managed to get herself to London and really struggled. She couldn't get a passage on board a ship. And she eventually got a passage with a Quaker captain from Bristol. And she landed in America. And then she thought, well, okay, what do I need to do to start my mission? Well, I better go and talk to the president. And of course, people said, well, don't be so silly. You know, he's not going to listen to you. What are you thinking of? But no, she decided she would get herself to Washington and go and talk to the president, who was Thomas Jefferson. And amazingly, she did. She had an interview, an audience with him, and she actually challenged him. She was very direct and asked him how many slaves he held. And apparently it was 300. but he assured her that the number was declining. And he couldn't give his blessing for her mission, but she told him that what she was going to do. And it's actually really interesting. He must have been so impressed with Dorothy, because it was actually 4 years later, in 1806, later on, that he invited Dorothy to preach in the Hall of Representatives. And she, I believe, was the very first woman to do so, to preach in there, which is just astonishing. So you can just get your measure of the woman. But she left Thomas Jefferson. She went and decided to go right to the slave-owning heart of the country. So down she goes to the south, to South Carolina, Charlestown, the center of the slave-owning peoples. She got herself on board ships to talk to captains to try and persuade them that it was wrong what they were doing. And of course, she put her own life in danger because people tried to stop her because she was threatening their livelihood. And her deep compassion for oppressed people led her into other areas. It took her into prisons, where she began campaigning for better prison reform. And she became involved with some of the native Indians and got caught up in their case and was speaking up for their rights and the evils that were being done to them. And she actually went and lived among native Indians for several months and made lifelong friendships with some of the women. Dorothy, interestingly, always saw herself as an evangelist, but she was, because for her compassion for people, her fighting for human rights was all a working out of the gospel. There were no boundaries between the two. She was just living and speaking about the gospel all the time. The church of her day wouldn't support her, but she had the courage to go out into the unknown and to follow God's call and to live out the gospel. I think she's an amazing inspiration. I actually came across her because she actually traveled backwards and forwards several times across the Atlantic during a long career, if you like, and she ended up in Nottinghamshire as part of the Primitive Methodist mission of 1818, and she opened the first Primitive Methodist chapel in Nottinghamshire at Bingham. She pops up in the records here and there with Lorenzo Dow. But I think Dorothy would have agreed with Desmond Tutu, who said, "I don't know which Bible they are reading when people say religion and politics don't mix. We will be judged not on whether we went to church each Sunday, but whether we fed the hungry." Feeding the hungry is something that our next woman, Annie Arch, knew all about. Now, many of you will have heard of Joseph Arch, who was, of course, a Primitive Methodist local preacher, who is well known for setting up the first farm labourers trade union in 1872. You may not have heard so much about his daughter, Annie. She was born in 1851, the third of 7 children. And it was quite a poor family. Her eldest brother became a farm labourer, and her next sister was a servant. And Annie remained at home working as a dressmaker. And it's interesting, she first learned to speak in public when, as a child, she read the lessons at the Primitive Methodist Chapel for, as she said, for local preachers who could exhort mightily but had no gift of letters. In other words, they couldn't read. So it's fine, you could preach with the fire of the Spirit, but then Annie would be brought in to read the lessons. By the time she was 18, she was a local preacher herself and became a gifted and popular speaker. And in fact, in 1874, the strains of his union work proved too much for Joseph Arch. His health gave way and he was forced to rest, but invitations kept coming in from union meetings for him to speak, and preaching at special services for labourers. And as Joseph was unable to go, it was Annie that took his place and took up his work. And it's interesting because as a preacher and as going around the trade union meetings, she was given hospitality in labourers' cottages. And so she had a chance to see firsthand for herself what conditions were like for the farm labourers and their families. And there's one story she told of sitting down for Sunday tea with a labourer's family when one of the children looked at the cake, and clearly in this cake, it was meant to be a fruit cake, but there wasn't a great deal of fruit in it. And one of the children said, "Mother, where were you standing when you threw the raisins into the cake?" And the mother said, "Ah, my lad, I was standing behind 9 shillings a week." And that's one of the stories that Annie used to tell in her campaign to improve the wages and living conditions for the farm labourers. Now, in 1880, Annie married a primitive Methodist minister called John Edwin Loyty, and she was quite amazing. As a primitive Methodist minister's wife, very unusually, she was continuing to support her father financially, and so she ran a draper's shop in Leamington as well. And that was incredibly rare for a woman to be able to do that at the same time as being a minister's wife, with all that entailed then. And Joseph Archie's diary reveals that he was then elected as one of the very first working class MPs. But in London, he often walked the streets without a penny in his pocket, and it was Annie that was sending him money. And he recorded in his diary how he was often in debt to Annie. Now, sadly, Annie's health also broke down under her punishing schedule, because in 1 year, she preached and spoke in 700 different places. That's quite a commitment. And so she was only 53 when she died. And her obituary in the Primitive Methodist magazine said, "The daughter of the man who gave our English peasants their political freedom by breathing a new soul into them was bound to have and had a noticeable personality." Annie Arch, I think, is one of those people I would like to meet. Maybe when I get to heaven, she's one of those people I can have a chat with. She was particularly keen on women's issues, and she also liked going around various meetings speaking about Bible women. She was a great champion for the hidden women in the Bible, as well as her championship for the farm labourers' wives. And her passion for social justice and human rights, her concern for working people, it went beyond the farm labourers. It said that during the South Wales coal strike, which caused huge suffering to many working families, she begged and helped to distribute many hundreds of pounds on behalf of the starving operatives and their families. What a woman. And yet we don't tend to know a lot about her. Now, my next woman is quite similar. Now, the work of Joseph and Annie Arch was carried on by another primitive local preacher you may have heard of, George Edwards, who founded the first national union of farm workers. But again, much less is known about his wife, Charlotte. She looks a bit formidable here, I must say. But they met when they were very young. And really, George couldn't have done anything that he did without Charlotte. And unusually, she was a farm labourer's daughter, but she could read and write. George couldn't. And I love the story that he was converted through a primitive Methodist chapel in his teens. And it's 3 weeks after their marriage, he was put on the plan to take his first service as a local preacher. And so Charlotte taught him off by heart 3 hymns and the first chapter of John's Gospel. And so he said he preached from the heart, but he managed to hold the hymn book and held the Bible. He didn't know if he held it the right way up or not, but he was able to take that service. And together they were very much took forward this ministry, not just through the chapels, but through the trade unions. George actually received criticism for some church people when he began holding open air services for labourers. But Charlotte and George searched the scriptures together, and they both became convinced that you cannot separate politics or social justice from religion. And this is what they said. I consider that every time I attend a Labour meeting, I attend a religious service in the strictest sense of the word. What movement can be more sacred than the one that has for its object the uplifting of man, the beautifying of human nature, and the restoring of that likeness and image of God which man has so long lost? Now, that's all very well for George, but what could Charlotte do? Of course, as a woman, she didn't even have the vote, let alone the opportunity to become a political leader. But things were to change a bit in 1894 when the District and Parish Councils Act introduced local council and districts, local county and district councils, and for the first time women could actually stand for office. So Charlotte stood for election and she was elected unanimously as one of those very first district councillors. This was in Norfolk, I think it's Erpingham, that district council. And being on the district council as a councillor meant she was also on the Board of Guardians. And the role of the Board of Guardians was to take an oversight of the administration of the Poor Law. So one day, a woman came to Charlotte with a problem. And she said, look, we've been given flour to make bread. Is what happened. They would give parish relief in kind. So the women were being given flour to make bread rather than money to buy bread. And the woman was in despair. She said, look, we've been given this flour. I can't make bread. This is what my bread looks like. It's as if the 2 outer crusts are like walls and there's nothing in the middle. We can't eat it. It's inedible. So Charlotte said, okay, well, give me some of your flour and I'll give you some of mine. We'll swap flour. We'll both make a loaf and see what happens. And Charlotte found that her loaf came out just the same. It was inedible. And of course, the woman could make perfectly good bread from good flour. So Charlotte took these loaves to the council meeting and to the Board of Guardians, and she said, look, you know, what's happening for these poor women? They can't make bread from this. And of course, the male councillors just said, oh, no, it's they're just poor women. They don't know how to make bread. They're not making it properly. But Charlotte was able to prove, because she'd made it, that it wasn't that case at all. And she was very cross and told them that her neighbours and sister working women could make as good bread as anyone else. And of course, what she did was she exposed what this huge fraud that was going on, because the Board of Guardians was subcontracting out the flour to middlemen, and what they were actually providing for the poor was basically sawdust off the sweepings of the floor. And Charlotte got that practice of giving poor relief in kind ended, and she got the women given money for their poor relief so that they could actually buy either flour or bread themselves. So she made a huge difference, and partly it was because she was a woman. The women could come to her and knew that she would listen to them, and she took their case forward. And then, because she was so respected, Charlotte was elected to the Workhouse Committee. And the first thing she did was went to inspect the workhouse for herself. And she found in the wash house there, in the laundry, a poor girl who was in a state of collapse. And she said, why is this girl not in the infirmary? And they said, oh, no, well, she gave birth. She's an unmarried mother. She had an illegitimate baby 5 days ago. So that's why she's here. And Charlotte discovered that unmarried girls who were often in the workhouse because there was literally nowhere else for them to go. And then it was a deliberate policy of punishing them by putting them to work in the laundry as soon as they'd given birth. And she highlighted this as absolutely cruel and pointed out that the girls were more often more sinned against than sinning, because of course, where are the fathers in all this? Got off scot-free. And Charlotte had a lot of stick for this, because by sticking up for unmarried mothers, she was accused of condoning immorality. And she was known to be a chapel woman, and no doubt some of the chapel members were amongst those who were accusing her of condoning immorality. And she spoke up, and she wouldn't be intimidated. And she said this was pure compassion for her fellow human beings. And this was just wrong. And she did, in the end, she shamed people, and the men in particular, into changing the system. It wasn't perfect, but she got it, the rules changed so that no girl was put to work in the laundry until at least 12 days after giving birth. But I'm quite challenged by Charlotte's courage and determination in tackling unpopular and controversial causes. I find that really inspiring. And I think it's a challenge to us to see, actually, it's easy to speak out for social justice campaigns that are popular, but not quite so easy to speak out when other Christians accuse us of condoning immorality. But that's what she did. And I think that challenges us. Now, the next woman that we're going to look at, Hannah Mitchell, was also a woman who understood the social issues facing women, particularly poor women, because of her own experience. And she later wrote an autobiography, which she called The Hard Way Up. I love that, because that gives you an insight into her background, The Hard Way Up. And in it, she grew up in the Peak District in Derbyshire. And so it was pretty remote. And she had no access really to schooling. Again, as a girl, it wasn't considered important, but she was passionate about getting an education. She could read, or she taught herself to read, but she didn't really have anyone to help her. So she said how important the Methodist chapel was for her learning, because she'd read, and when she came across a word that she didn't know, she didn't understand what it meant, she didn't know how to pronounce it. And chapel on Sundays, she would listen really hard until the preacher might pronounce or say one of these words that she didn't understand, and so that she could sort of grow in her understanding. Mind you, she said some weeks it may have been that a local preacher that said it, and then she couldn't really trust them because they were only sort of farm labourers and like her father, and she didn't really trust because they probably didn't know either. So she was very pleased when it was a minister preaching, because she felt she could trust him and learn more from him. Now, she had to leave home at the age of 13 to go into service, as of course many poor girls did. And she had aspirations to be a teacher. I mean, sadly, she never did achieve that dream, but she was passionate about learning and improving her education. And as a servant, you're on call pretty much all day. You don't have a lot of time. So she determined to leave service and become a dressmaker, which was, it's not a great income, but it meant she had more time. And once she had a lovely job when she had to do some sewing in the home of a school teacher who let her have access to his library, which she thought was just paradise. So she then found, she was in Bolton, and she wanted to meet with others that had the same sort of passions and interests that she did. And through that, she became involved in the socialist movement and joined the Labour Church. And that's where she met her husband, who was a socialist and a tailor. But I don't know whether to feel sorry for Hannah's husband or not. Maybe you will. But she was very disillusioned by marriage because she thought she'd found a nice socialist husband. And at first, he agreed with her that there should be an equal division of labour in their household. But she soon found that the reality didn't quite live up to that ideal. And I thought it's quite interesting, you will have heard during COVID, it again, I think quite a lot of women found that that equal division of labour didn't quite work in their households either. But in 1904, Hannah became involved with Emmeline Pankhurst, and she was actually one of 6 women who founded the Women's Social and Political Union, which is known better, of course, as the Suffragettes. But for Hannah, it was really hard because women like the Pankhursts didn't have to work for a living. But actually, for her, not only was she working very long hours, but she then got the housework and childcare as well. And she said in her autobiography how hard this was, because she said, no cause can be won between dinner and tea. And most of us who were married had to work with one hand tied behind us. So I think that's why, being a suffragette if you're a working woman was no easy matter. But she persisted. She had things thrown at her when she spoke at public meetings. And once she was actually arrested after she interrupted Winston Churchill at an election meeting. And she was imprisoned in strange ways. And she was absolutely furious with her husband because he came and bailed her out. And she really wanted to go to court and be, really have her day in court and say her piece. And she accused her husband of being more concerned for his stomach than for the battle for emancipation. He wanted to make sure his dinner was on the table. By 1908, she actually broke with the Pankhursts because she felt that the WSPU had broken their promise to working women, because increasingly the leadership was dominated by a group of wealthy women, and she felt they had just lost touch with the concerns of poor women. She was concerned about more than just votes for women, but actually about the whole of women, working women's lives. And so instead, she joined the pacifist Women's Freedom League. But she continued to really fight for women's suffrage, but because of her concern much more widely, she is, interestingly, like Charlotte Edwards, she saw that the way she could work out what for her was the gospel message, that loving your neighbour, was through being elected to the council, where she could really make a difference. And she was elected to Manchester City Council in 1924 and served for 11 years. And she said that her proudest achievement was to get a public wash house built, because that public wash house made a huge difference to working women's lives. And other issues she really campaigned for in Manchester were free libraries and public parks. And Hannah saw herself as a rebel. Now, that's really sad to me, because she had to do all this outside the establishment, really outside the church. Why didn't the church support her? I find this really difficult because there were Methodist Central Halls opened in Bolton and Manchester at the beginning of the 20th century, whose mission was for the poor. But why did she not fit? Was it because she was a woman? Or I suspect, was it because if she'd have been doing good work inside the church, that may have been all right. But sadly, most church members still thought that a woman's role was to look after her husband, not to engage in politics. And I just really want to pose a question from Hannah's story as to how we support people in our churches who are involved in local politics. Because I was very saddened when I was talking to one Methodist who is a local councillor, and he told me that no one in his church ever asked about the work he did as a councillor or ever offered to pray for him. Now, oh, she looks rather grand, doesn't she? I quite like this picture. Ethel Anakin was born into a primitive Methodist family in Harrogate in 1881. And she was described as a woman of strong will. I think we can probably see it in that picture. And what did take strength to leave home against her family's wishes to train as a teacher in Liverpool. And in Liverpool, she found that the main student church was Pembroke Baptist Chapel. And at the time, there was a very radical minister, Charles Aked, who, incredibly, his average congregation he was attracting was 1,900 people. Quite incredible. And what Charles Aked was doing, partly, he was a Christian socialist, and through his influence, Ethel became one too, but he was engaged with the church members in social work in the slums of Liverpool. And this led to Ethel's passion and concern for the poor and for actually living out your faith in practice where it really mattered. In 1905, she married Philip Snowden. He was a bit older than her. He was also from a Methodist family. His father was a weaver and a chartist. And they both became members of the Independent Labour Party, which was formed at the end of the 19th century. I don't know how much you know about the ILP, but it was closely allied to the Primitive Methodist Church. And it became a home for many disillusioned Prims who felt that the church had become too concerned to support the status quo rather than challenging the government on issues. And in fact, that's particularly true on the outbreak of the First World War, when the Prims did a complete U-turn from preaching peace, and they were a pacifist church right up to the outbreak of war. When war was declared, the church leadership turned around completely and said a Christian's duty is to support the state. Therefore, we had to support the government in the war. And a lot of Prims felt they couldn't do that. And Ethel and Philip were both pacifists and remained so. And in fact, Ethel, during the war, organised the Women's Peace Crusade. And in 1918, she spoke to 500,000 people. Incredible. Urging people to follow Christ's teaching to love one another. Ethel, like Hannah Mitchell, was a tremendous supporter of women's suffrage. And interesting, she wasn't involved with the Pankhursts, in 1906, she became one of the national speakers for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, led by Millicent Fawcett, who were known as suffragists. I'm sure you probably know the difference. Suffragists were the more peace-loving. They didn't agree with the more militant tactics of the suffragettes. And again, she had a punishing speaking schedule. 200 public meetings a year was not uncommon. And because Ethel was recognised as an outstanding public speaker, she was asked to stand as an MP. But there was a dilemma because Philip also was asked to stand as an MP. They decided they couldn't both stand, and so she decided to support Philip's campaign. Whether that's because as a man he would have more chance of being elected, or whether as a wife she felt that was her duty, who knows. But Philip was elected, and you may have heard of Philip Snowden because in 1924 he became Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Labour government of that day. And it's quite interesting to see how I think he was very influenced by Ethel's views. They clearly worked on it together because she actually had already published a book in which she advocated a state salary for mothers. Now, I still think that's a really interesting idea, a state salary for mothers, which I think would help a lot of single mothers and working mothers today. I still think that's got some legs. He didn't manage to introduce that into his first budget, but what he did do was reduce taxes on food, reduced spending on armaments, and he provided money for council housing. He also aimed to introduce pensions for widows and reduce the pension age to 65, which eventually got there. Ethel, in the meantime, she was elected to the national executive of the women's section of the Labour Party, and she became part of a delegation to Russia in 1920. And on her return, she was actually very outspokenly critical of what she'd seen. And that made her quite unpopular in some quarters. Again, I think she's quite brave, another woman who was prepared to speak out even though her views were unpopular. But this is what she told a reporter. I oppose Bolshevism because it is not socialism, it is not democracy, and it is not Christianity. Now, although she was invited to address the Methodist Conference in 1927, but generally the church failed to appreciate her immense gifts as a public speaker or her passion for campaigning. It was clearly, it was one thing to speak about love of your neighbour in the pulpit, but it was another to try and change the systems that kept people in poverty. I wonder really sometimes how much things have changed. And I found it quite interesting to read. In 2015, there was an article in the Methodist Recorder that was lamenting the disappearance of the long tradition of Methodist involvement in the House of Commons. What's interesting, it pointed out that in 1906, there were 49 Methodist MPs. 37 of them were Liberals, 49 MPs. And by 2015, after that election, there were none, no Methodist MPs. The last 3 stood down in 2015. And as far as I know, we have only 1 Methodist MP in the House of Commons today. That, you probably are aware, is Cat Smith, the Labour MP for Lancaster and Fleetwood. Why don't we have more? If we are serious as a church about loving justice, why have we lost that tradition of being involved in politics? It's interesting because William Younger, who was president of the Primitive Methodist Conference at one stage, he actually wrote in the Christian Messenger about Ethel and saying she was one of the most remarkable women of this generation. And he regretted that the church completely failed to use her. He said, but I think the problem was, what he was saying was, he wanted Ethel to support the church rather than saying, how can we as a church support her in the issues of social justice that she feels called to campaign for? I think that's a challenge, really, how we don't just suck people in to internal church thing or feel we've got to own things, but how do we support Methodist Christians working for social justice wherever they are in the community? I am going to end very soon now. We'll just come to look at a couple of Methodist women today. A couple of my heroines, there we are. So at the top there, we've got Tracy Hume, one of our deacons. And there she is. She has led this photograph, which actually she got onto the BBC National News when she led this protest in 2016, handcuffing herself to the church railings in Gateshead to protest against benefit sanctions. And I think we need to do far more now about the loss of the £20 universal credit, but I won't get on too much on my hobby horse. Or maybe I will. Then at the bottom, you'll recognise Rachel Lampard. And there she is, addressing an anti-Trident rally. And of course, Rachel heads up the joint public issues team of the Methodist, Baptist, URC and Church of Scotland, working together for peace and justice. So it's great that we celebrate our Methodist women today, not just those in the past. So just to end, I want to conclude with some words said by the Archbishop of York earlier this year. He said he could not be part of a church which did not have a political voice, adding, "It's so much at the heart of what I believe to be the calling of the church. We've learnt to accommodate things that we know are wrong, which it would be possible to do something about. Loving your neighbour is a profoundly political statement." And it's something that these women that we've looked at this afternoon got. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jill. Thank you. I'd invite everyone to, while muted, applaud. Yeah. Thank you, Jill. That was great. Really inspiring. Thank you. I'm sure it's generated lots of thoughts and questions of people here. I'm actually going to stop the recording now, but there is some time for questions. So I'll just stop the recording now.